Hello and welcome to the Synthesis video tutorial. In this video, we will cover the game's components, rules, and basic gameplay. Before we get started, check to make sure that your copy of Synthesis has all of the following components. 1 rules booklet, 6 jumbo-sized player cheat sheet cards, an ions and molecules deck of 36 cards, a compounds deck of 14 cards, an elements deck of 100 cards, and 21 black cube counters. You will also need a pen or pencil and some paper to keep track of everyone's score. The game of Synthesis is a tactical race. The game ends when at least one of the following objectives is met. Any player reaches the goal score, or any player synthesizes a compound. The goal score is the total number of points any player is required to obtain in order to end the game. Once a player reaches the goal score, the game ends at the end of that player's turn. Technically, your group can agree on any goal score you want. Just keep in mind that a larger goal score means longer playtime. Compounds are complex combinations of elements which require more than just a single hand of cards to synthesize. Synthesizing a compound is an optional endgame objective and is high risk, high reward. If any player synthesizes a compound, the game ends at the end of that player's turn. But be careful, however, if the game ends while you own an incomplete compound, you will lose points equal to that compound's mass. Ions and molecules are simpler combinations of elements and can always be synthesized using 6 or fewer cards. Most of your time should be spent synthesizing ions and molecules, as they are more valuable while the game is running and at the end of the game when the final scores are calculated. Elements are the fundamental building blocks of all things. So, in Synthesis, element cards are equally fundamental. Your hand will be mostly, if not completely, composed of element cards. You will use these cards to synthesize molecules, ions, and compounds to acquire points. The bottom of noble gas cards show that their valence electrons are full. This means that they cannot be combined with other element cards under normal circumstances, and are considered to be dead cards. In the elements deck are 8 special effect cards stashed away. These cards have special powers that, when played strategically, can give you a definitive edge, either on your scorecard or in the compound race. Unless otherwise stated on the card itself, effect cards can only be played on your own turn before you perform your action. Multiple effect cards can be played in a single turn, but are fully resolved in the order in which they were played. Each counter represents one instance of the ion or molecule beneath it. If after synthesis the ion or molecule already has a counter on it, simply add another one. There is no limit to the number of counters that any one ion or molecule may have on it. However, once all 20 counters have been placed, no more can be placed until the reserve has at least one counter replenished. Keep in mind that you can still synthesize ions or molecules, even if the reserve is empty. This just means that no more cubes will be added onto that ion or molecule. As a general rule, the yellow numbers located in the upper right-hand corner of a card indicates its value. So, when determining how many points to add to a player's score, look for those yellow numbers. Subscripts are the small numbers found in synthesis requirements and are always attached to the element symbol to their left. Subscripts indicate how many of that element card you need. An element symbol without a number means that you only need one of that element. Now that we understand the components, we are ready to set up our first game. Decide amongst yourselves what the goal score should be for this game. A score between 3 and 500 points is recommended for beginners. Use a method that everyone agrees upon to determine who should go first. Keep in mind that the first player does have a slight advantage. Vigorously shuffle each of the 3 decks and place the decks face down in the middle of the table within reach of every player. Take the bottom card from the elements deck and place it face up on the table next to that deck. This is the discard pile. Each player then draws their opening hand of 6 cards from the top of the elements deck, starting with the first player, then followed by the player to their left, and so on. Make sure you keep your hand to yourself at all times. Next, take 4 cards from the top of the Elements deck and place them face up in a line next to the discard pile. These are the community elements. Take the top 4 cards from the Ions and Molecules deck and place them face up in a line next to the community elements. These are the community ion and molecules. Together, these 8 cards make up what's known as the community. Place 20 of the black cube counters into the space next to the discard pile. This is the reserve. Note that you should have 1 extra cube. This is a spare for lost cube emergencies. For a 5 or 6 player game, add 1 additional element and 1 additional ion or molecule to the community. For a 7 and 8 player game, you will use 6 total elements and 6 total ions or molecules. There also needs to be some space between each player and the cards in the middle of the table. This area is called the tableau and is used to store ions and molecules that each player synthesizes. Each player's turn will follow the same steps in order. Obtain a compound card, optional, perform an action, refill your hand and discard, refill the community. To obtain a compound card, secretly look at the top 3 cards from the compound's deck. Once you have done so, you must choose one. Keep that card hidden and place the remaining 2 cards on the bottom of the compound's deck in any order. Remember, a compound card is not considered to be part of your hand. Once you have taken a compound card, you are stuck with it for the remainder of the game. You may not take more than 1 compound card or exchange it for any other compound card. For the rest of the game, you should focus on trying to acquire the elements needed to synthesize that compound you have chosen. For your single action on your turn, you must either cycle or synthesize. You may not perform both actions. You may choose to cycle if you have unwanted or useless cards in your hand, or if there are community elements or discards you want to have. In order to cycle, first, set aside the cards in your hand that you are willing to discard or want to get rid of. Second, take the same number of cards from any combination of the community elements, the top of the elements deck, and the top of the discard pile. Third, place the cards you set aside on top of the discard pile in any order you choose. Fill any holes in the community with cards from their respective decks. Your turn is now over. Most of your actions will be to synthesize. This is the act of combining elements in your hand, ions, and/or molecules to form a resultant. You may only synthesize once during your turn, even if you only want to synthesize the same thing. To make 8, combine element cards in your hand so that their valence electrons add up to 8. The resultant is the combination of all the element cards you used. Calculate the resultant's value by adding together the mass on each element card that you used. Add that value to your score. Place all of the cards that were used, including cards played by opponents, into the discard pile in any order that you choose. At the end of your turn, you must refill your hand to 6 cards. You may take cards from the top of the elements deck and/or the community elements. You may not take cards from the discard pile. Fill any holes in the community with cards from their respective decks. You may synthesize an ion or molecule in the community or in any player's tableau. To do so, meet the synthesis requirements listed on the bottom of that ion or molecule card. That ion or molecule is the resultant. If the card was in the community, move it to your tableau. Add its value to your score and place a counter onto it. Place all of the cards that were used, including cards played by opponents, into the discard pile in any order that you choose. At the end of your turn, you must refill your hand to 6 cards. You may not take cards from the discard pile. Fill any holes in the community with cards from their respective decks. Ions with counters on them allow you to interact with them in a unique way. Combine one or more elements from your hand with one ion on the tableau that has at least one counter on it. The charge value in the upper left-hand corner of the ion indicates how many more or fewer valence electrons, from the regular 8, you need in order to synthesize with it. Remove a counter from the ion after synthesis is complete. The resultant is the combination of all element cards you used plus that ion. The resultant's value is the sum of the mass of all elements involved plus the ion's mass. Place all of the cards that were used, including cards played by opponents, into the discard pile in any order that you choose. At the end of your turn, you must refill your hand to 6 cards. You may not take cards from the discard pile. Fill any holes in the community. Using the composition method is the only way to properly synthesize compounds. To use the composition method, satisfy the synthesis requirements on the bottom of an ion, molecule, or compound card by combining elements from your hand and/or ions or molecules with counters on them in the tableau. Don't forget to remove any counters from ions or molecules you used in this synthesis. That card becomes a resultant. Add its value to your score and place a counter onto it. If it was from the community, move it to your tableau. You may use any number of ions or molecules in this method, provided that you can use all of the elements of which they are composed of. Below the synthesis requirements on compound cards, you'll find the recommended composition list. This is the fastest and easiest way to synthesize that compound. It is not the only way, however, and you can synthesize it however you're able to. If on your turn you are able to use all of the cards in your hand while synthesizing for your action, you get an extra 50-point bonus at the end of your turn. This bonus cannot be affected by effect cards. And you can obtain this bonus even if you started your turn with fewer than 6 cards in your hand. At the end of your turn, you must refill your hand to 6 cards. If you have synthesized at all during your turn, you may take cards from the top of the elements deck and/or the community elements. You may not take cards from the discard pile. When refilling your hand, you take cards one at a time, meaning you don't have to decide where you want to take cards from ahead of time. Once you have taken a card, however, you may not put it back. You only refill your hand during this step of the turn, even if you start your turn with fewer than 6 cards in your hand. If at any time the community contains more than one noble gas card, discard the community elements in a random order and draw up a new set of community elements. Once the game ends by someone reaching the goal score, or a player synthesizing a compound, a few score adjustments must be made. First, players who possess compounds that they couldn't synthesize must reduce their score by an amount equal to their compound's mass. Players will then get an extra 2 points for each ion and molecule card in their tableau, regardless of how many counters those ions or molecules have on them. Every card is worth 2 points. After these adjustments, the player with the highest total score is declared the winner. In the event of a tie, victory goes to the player with the most ions and molecules in their tableau,